Hi everyone, welcome to the first lesson of Houdini 145 Impact-Based Particle Setups. I'm Geronimo Mashi and I'm going to be the instructor throughout this course. I have prepared this 3-shot sequence of a car chase for us to work with. I'd like to thank and give credit to Kristina Herlichkova for doing the layout and animation. The idea behind this is to apply all the techniques I'm going to be showing you while mimicking a production environment. Our task is to add different effects to this sequence, all based on impact-based particle setups. Most of these tasks are the ones a junior artist will very likely find herself or himself doing, so by the end of the course, you will have all the necessary skills to tackle shots like this. We're going to cover only the effects involving particles. We won't be doing any fluid dynamics such as dust or smoke, but feel free to add those by yourself at the end of this course. So let's get started. I'm going to walk you through the sequence and the folder structure. As you can see, we have 3 shots involving a car chase. The blue Range Rover is being chased by the black enemy car. On some shots, like the first and the last one, we have what I refer to as an extra car. The first 2 shots are pretty simple. We are just going to have bullets hitting the ground. The idea is that the enemy car is trying to shoot the tires of the Range Rover. The third shot is the biggest and most fun probably. We will start by adding the bullets hit on the ground, and then we can see there's already an RVD simulation of the wall impacts, which we will use to emit secondary particles from to complement that effect. We're also going to break the window of the Range Rover as it drifts, and finally add 2 elements on the car crash. This will be car debris from the hit and another window break. Now let's have a look at the folder structure. I'm calling this sequence the car chase sequence, or CRC for short. The shots are numbered 10, 20, and 30, which is what you would get in production. Shots aren't numbered 1, 2, and 3, and so on. They're always in increments of 10 at least. This allows you to easily add new shots in between. For example, by adding shot 15 in between these 2, we would have an extra shot without having to change the names of the previous shots. Sometimes the shot numbers can get longer. It really depends on every studio and every client, but 10, 20, and 30 is quite common. So we have a folder for every shot, and inside of it, you can find the animation of every vehicle, along with a layout preview of the shot. So here we have the enemy car, the extra car, and the Range Rover. And inside you're going to find a BGS sequence for the whole frame range. There is also a layout folder which has all the assets such as the road and the house, which are shared across all the other shots. Finally, there are 3 HIP files, which have the cameras, the layout, and the animation already loaded for you. These are the HIP files you'll start working from in a production environment, so I recommend you work from these files as well. Alright, now let's finally get started. The first effect we will work on is the bullets hitting the ground, and the best shot to develop the setup is the second one, which is right here. So the idea will be to have pieces of dirt kicking up behind the vehicle as it drives through, and then we're going to do the same for the shot number 10 and shot number 30. So let's open up CRC20. As you can see, we have the camera over here, and I've locked all the parameters so we don't accidentally move it. Then we have our cars over here. We have the Range Rover and the enemy car over there. And then here we have the environment. So I'm loading each one of these elements individually. Now the very first thing you have to do when you get to this project is set your job variable. And for that you have to go to File, Set Project, and in my case my job variable is in my home directory, and then I made a folder called fxphd who145. So this is where the whole project is going to be. So I'm going to make sure that's my project. I think I already have it set there, so it won't let me change it. You can see if I evaluate this, that job is expanded to fxphd who145, and then we're adding class 1 layout. It's very important that you set that variable to your own local path if you want all the projects to work. The nice thing is that every single file is pointing to that job variable. So the first time you open it, it won't work, but once you go to File, Set Project, and you set it to this folder, so as you can see, Documents, fxphd, so wherever all your fxphd course is, that is going to be your project folder. Once we have that done, we can save this file something different so we don't override it. So I'm going to call it class 1 in my case. Okay, and now we're ready to get started. So another thing you might notice is that this shot starts at frame 1001. Every shot you do in production will start at either 101 or 100 or 1000 or 1001. And the reason for that is to be able to easily add pre-roll. Pre-roll means starting an effect before the shot actually starts, so that in the first frame of the shot there's already something. Or it could also be so that an animation starts before the first frame, so that there's motion blur. In our case, we actually need pre-roll as well, since we want to see bullets hitting the ground right over here, already in this first frame. So in order to do that, we have to start our simulation a few frames before 1001. Basically, whenever your shot starts in the middle of the action, you will usually want to have pre-roll. So to do this, we're going to change our timeline to start at 995, for example. So I'll go here, set it to 995. And this is going to give us 6 frames of pre-roll. So you can see how useful starting at frame 1001 is. If we had started at frame 1, we would have had to change the start frame to -5. And you never want to work with negative numbers. You will have a lot of issues handling caches with negative frames. So starting from 1001 allows us to have up to 1000 frames of pre-roll, which is more than enough. Some studios start from 100, but in my personal opinion, 100 frames isn't always enough, especially when dealing with something like a smoke simulation. Many times I've used way more than even 200 frames of pre-roll, so personally I like to start at 1001. Okay, let's play this to see how it looks. You will immediately notice that it's very slow. And this isn't just my computer. Playing any animation, whether it's alembics or a sequence of BGOs like in this case, it's rarely going to play in real time. This is because the animation isn't transforming, it's deforming. There's actually a difference between the two. When an object is moved at object level, for example here, we can see that the position attribute in this case isn't changed. That is because the whole object is being moved. So we call that a transformation. Instead, if we go inside and we create a transform node, and now we move it over here, you can see that the P attribute is changing. So we're actually modifying every single point. And what's happening right now is that our file node right here is reading the different position for every point, every single frame. So that's very slow. And there's a way to get around this, especially when you're dealing with a transformation, which means that all your points are moving exactly the same way. There's no need to tell all your points to move every frame the same amount. You can just tell the whole object to move once. So that's what we're going to do. It's really important to spend some time at the beginning to properly set up your scene so everything plays at real-time speed. I'll show you one trick you can use for this. This only works when you have a non-deforming object. That means that when you're dealing with something like a character, for example, where every point is moving differently every frame, it's not going to work. But in this case, our car and even the wheels, it's all moving like it's one single solid object. So what we can do with that is we can extract the transformation, which means we can extract how much it's moving every frame, and we can apply it at object level. So to begin with, I want to fix something that's going to happen whenever you have pre-roll. So if we go to the frames before our animation starts, in this case 1000, you'll see that it's going to tell us that there's no such file. And that's because our animation is only cached from frame 1001 onwards. So to fix this, we can add a time shift in here. And we can tell it to only clamp the first frame. And we can tell it 1001. And what this means is that anything before 1001 is going to hold the value of 1001. So I'm going to copy this, and let's do it as well for the enemy car. There we go. Okay, and the first thing I want to do is I'm going to create a new geometry object, and I'm going to turn both of these off, and I'm going to call it Range Rover Extract. And let's go inside of it. And I'm going to object merge the Range Rover. The basic idea behind this is that if every single object, right, if we select whether it's the wheel or the windshield or any other part of the car, if they all move exactly the same, And the thing that's making it slow is that we have, 300,000 points being read every frame. If we only select a few of them, like for example the windshield, so I'm going to select 3D connected geometry and delete everything except the windshield. So in theory, if these points are moving the same amount as everything else, we only really need the windshield to calculate this matrix. And this is going to be a lot faster because now we're dealing with only 698 points. And we can make this even faster to read from disk by, for example, deleting everything except the points. So we don't even need primitives for this, right? Just to calculate the difference between one frame and the other, we only need to look at points. And we also don't need any attributes. So we can create a clean. And let's remove all the attributes and all the groups. And I'll turn this off so it doesn't actually kill our points. Okay, and there's two things we need to calculate a matrix. First is we need a rest geometry. So I'm going to time shift this to the first frame. And this is now going to become our rest, like that. And then I'm going to cache this one to disk so that it's very fast, because this is still reading from the Range Rover animation, which is heavy. So you can see it's faster, but it's not extremely fast. Let's actually see how fast it is. So let's press D and let's go to guides. Let's show time. There we go. So let's see, right now it's playing at 15 frames per second. So what I want to do is create a file cache. And let's see, we're going to cache all of it, set it to automatic. And let's see, we can call this cache Range Rover. And this can be, OS is going to be the operator string. So we can call this Range Rover transform. And let's see how it's going to look. So class 1 cache Range Rover transform. Okay, it's perfect. So let's save to disk. And now let's call this anim. So now if we play this, there we go. Now we're getting like 90 frames per second. And the trick now is to create an extract transform node. And this node takes a rest geometry and an animated geometry, and it will calculate the translate and the rotate between the two. So in our case, that is going to be Range Rover extract rest. I'll copy it and let's paste it here, replace it for anim. So by default, this node isn't going to do anything. It's just calculating the transform and it's storing it at object level. So the way it works is that you need to create another geometry and you have to parent it. And what's going to happen is that this transform is going to be applied to this geometry. So now we need to object merge our car in here. So for that, we need to make another static version of it. So I'm just going to copy this time shift and paste it over here. So we want the whole car, but this time we don't want it to be time dependent. Not sure why. It still says it's time dependent. It's not cooking properly. Let's see. There we go. I'm going to create another null node and call it out static. Oops, static. Okay, then now we can go in here and call it, for example, Range Rover playback, and this is going to be our extract transform. And in here, all we have to do is just merge that static car. So out static. And we can turn this one off. And basically what we've done is we left our static car here, and this is applying the object level transform. And now if we hit play, you can see our car is playing extremely fast. Right, so that's one trick I always like to do whenever I'm dealing with animated objects that are playing very slow. You want to be able to play everything real time. You don't want to be wasting time waiting for flipbooks when it's not necessary. Alright, so let's do the same for the enemy car. So I'll just copy and paste this. We can call this enemy car extract 1. And here we just have to change this for the enemy car. And let's see, we have to select the windshield. So I'm going to select over here 3D connected geometry again. I'll select the windshield, press enter. Okay, and then let's rename this to enemy car. And also over here, it's going to be enemy car. So let's save to disk. And now let's go back out. And now we should see, if we look again through the camera and we hit play. So the first time it plays, it's going to be quite slow because it has to cache it. And actually it seems that this one is still slow. So let's see. I'm going to rename this to enemy car playback. Let's make sure these ones aren't selected and let's see. There we go. Now it's working. So I'll turn on the real-time toggle again. Alright, and now it's actually playing real-time speed. So from now on, in all the other shots, you're going to see me doing this for all the other cars. I'm not going to be showing it, but I'll just be copying the same setup and applying it. Alright, now we're finally ready to get started with our effect. So let's move on to creating the source for our bullet impacts. Since we're going to be dealing with particles, our source is just going to be made out of points. Not only in this effect, but in all the others throughout this course. So in this case, what I want to create is like a clump of particles where the bullet hit. So the bullet is going to hit the ground and you can imagine an area, like for example, we have a circle in there and it's going to be full of points. And all those points are going to represent dirt debris that are going to shoot up. And it's going to look like the bullet is actually hitting the ground. We don't actually have to create the bullets. We just have to create the places where the bullet hits. So the easiest way to do this, especially since we're going to be doing it in multiple shots, is to make a system that we're going to be able to place and move throughout all our shots. And we want to have an input, and that's going to be the path where our bullets are hitting. So the easiest thing for that is to create a curve. So I'm just going to create a curve over here. And the easiest thing is to go to the top view. And let's see, let's zoom in. So I want to see, actually before that, let's see at what frame the car is exiting. So I would say at 28, the car is outside the camera view. So let's go back to the top view. So we want to have a trail that goes from this frame to the first one. And in here we can see there's a little bit of space behind the camera. So let's see, I'll start clicking. And the idea is that we just keep moving forward. And these hits don't have to be precise at all. We're going to be editing them later. And don't worry about the amount either. So let's see, let's go to 28. So that's the last one. And I'll press escape. And now let's actually visualize this. Let's look at these points. Ghost the other objects. There we go. So we can change this at any point. Let's add a null node in here and call it our out. And these are going to be our bullet impact guide. Okay, and we don't need to see it. And the effect itself, we're actually going to make it here. So this will be our bullet impact effects. So let's object merge this. All right. And then the first thing I want to do is I want to resample this and I want to set up how many impacts we're going to have. So for that, I'm going to enable maximum segments, and you can see right now we have 11 points. So let's say I'm going to go with something like 50, for example, and let's look at it from the camera view. So all these are the ones we're going to see in here. Now, something that's worth explaining before we continue working on this source is actually how important having a good source is. If there's one thing to take away from this course, is that the source is the most important thing. I always spend most of the time in subs working on the source, and I just make very few tweaks in the simulation itself. So take your time adjusting all the parameters to get a good source. There's no need to rush into the simulation. So what makes a good source? The answer to that is variation. So what does that mean? There are 4 key things where you can add variation, and that is variation in the location, in the amount, in the velocity, and in the emission. Variation in the location involves having an interesting distribution between every impact. So we can have impacts that are close to each other, for example, and then others that are further apart. Right now you can see it's pretty much evenly distributed, so it's not looking too interesting. Then we have variation in the amount. That means we want to have some small impacts and some big impacts, and then the bigger impacts are going to have a lot more particles, and the smaller ones will have a lot less particles. The variation in the velocity is one of the most important, since it will determine how the particles will behave in the simulation. And finally, we can also have variation in the emission, which means to have impacts emitted at different frames. So instead of just having this impact go off and on the next one this one, and so on, we can add a bit of variation, so it's not just a linear progression. So we can say in one frame this goes off, in the next one this one does, and in the next one nothing happens, and then in the next frame this one goes off, and then these two go off in the same frame, and so on. The idea is, again, to not just have a boring, simple linear progression. So let's get started with the very first part. Let's add variation to the location. So right now, if we look at this from the top view, we're going to see that this is very evenly distributed. So an easy way to break that up is to add a point jitter. And we can see over here, we can change the scale in every axis. But if we go over here, we can see we're adding this jitter in every axis, and we don't need it in the y-axis. We only want it along the x-axis and along the z-axis. So this is going to control basically what I was saying, like the distance between all of them. So the best is to go and look at this from, actually let's go back to ghost view. So we want to look at this from the camera view. So we can see we're getting a more interesting distribution of this. And let's see, I'm going to keep increasing it, maybe 1.5. And I think this might be too much for this axis. So let's see, maybe 0.3. I think something like that is nice. So we have like a big gap, then we have a few of them together. Here we have a lot of them together, and then a few more. We can also change the seed just to get something different. And we're going to get back to this eventually. But okay, the next thing I want to make sure that they are all right against the ground. So for that, I'm going to object merge our ground under our environment, and then road out. Okay, that's our road. And we're going to do minimum distance. Let's not show the guide geometry. And we don't need the line anymore, so let's just work with points for now. Okay. And then I want to start seeing the progression. I want to see, basically we're going to set the timeline to when they start appearing, and I want them all to appear in one frame, which is the frame where they're going to be emitted. So for that, I'm going to create an impact ID. So let's go to a point wrangle, and we're going to say I at bullet impact is equal to point number. So the I here means that we're going to be creating an integer attribute, and it's going to be equal to our point number. And you can see it's very simple. It's just copying the point number into there. And I don't want it to start at 0. I always like my IDs to start at 1, so I'm just going to add 1 to it. Okay, and we might have a problem with this, and that is if you look at the point numbers here, I'm going to hide everything for now. The problem is that when we jitter this, if you jitter it, it might not be enough in this case, but let's say we do this times 5. You can see the order can get lost, especially, actually, let's just do times 5 here, so times 5. You can see we can have 0, 1, 2. Okay, it's not doing it. Let's do times 10. There we go. So now we have 0, 1, 2, 4, and 3. Right, so this is so much, this axis scale, that it's actually flipping them. And the problem is that our impact, we want it to be progressive. And right now it's going to go this impact, this impact, this impact, then number 3, and then it's gonna go backwards. So an easy fix for that is to just sort everything by the x-axis, and then let's reverse it. And there we go. Now we can see that they're all properly increasing along the x-axis. Okay. We can bring back the environment. And now this is going to be our, let's call it our hit locations. I'm gonna press H to zoom on everything. And just so we don't have these issues with the viewport, I'm actually going to go into the environment and let's turn off a few things we're not using. Like for example, we don't need the houses in this shot or the silos. And I think that's it. Hopefully that will, well, I still think it's gonna give us issues. It's just our scene is too big, so the auto home isn't working that well. Anyways, let's move on to animating this so that they are only visible when they are being emitted. So for that, I'm going to create a point pop, and let's call this our animate hits. Let's just give it a color. This is going to be a pretty important node. Let's go inside. And what I want to get is a value that goes from 0 to 1 between all these points. So I want to get we're going to be using the bullet impact. So I'm going to bind it, and that's an integer. And I'm going to convert it to a float, so integer to float. And I want to divide this by the total number of bullet impacts that we have. So right now that is 51. And let's get that procedurally. So I'm just going to promote this. And we will say I want to get the bullet impact. Let's promote it to detail. Let's get the maximum and let's not delete it. And we can call it max bullet impacts. Right, so now we have 51 there. That way, if we ever change our resample over here, our system will still work. And now let's do a get attribute. So we want to get an integer from the first input detail, and we call it max bullet impact. And let's also turn it from an integer to a float. And let's divide it. And now if we export this and we call it our hit frame, for example, we should have an attribute that goes from 0 to 1. And for some reason this isn't working. So let's say it might be this one, max bullet impact. Oh, I missed an S. Okay. There we go. So our hit frame now goes all the way to 1. So what I'd like to do with this is I want to fit this from 0 to 1 to our emit frame. So this is going to be our start frame, and this is going to be our end frame. And let's convert it. I'm going to stick with floats, but I'm going to round it to an integer. So round to integer. There we go. And let's go up. And now we can say 995, and then our last frame is going to be, let's say that the car reaches that frame we set at 1028. We want to add a bit of delay, so let's say 1032, because we want the impacts to be trailing behind the ground. Okay, and this is going to give us our hit frame. And as you can see, it's going to start at 96 and it's going to keep going. And we can add an extra thing in here, and that is when we're still dealing with 0 to 1 values, we can create a ramp in here. And that's going to allow us to change this from a linear animation. If you want, we can add a slow in or an ease in or an ease out, right? So I'm going to call this our speed ramp. Okay, and to visualize this, I'm going to create a delete node. And we're going to set it to points, delete non-selected by expression, and I'll say our frame is equal to our hit frame. Right, so we can see already here we're starting to get these bullets appearing in there. So let's show everything. Let's go back to camera view. Actually, maybe let's ghost it and let's play it to see how this is looking. So I think this might work. So as you can see, our bullets are always behind. You have to take into consideration that this is the frame where they're going to be emitted. So this frame is going, the simulation will start. So by the time that we actually see it, it's going to be back there. But anyways, we can come back and change this at any point. If your bullets are appearing too far, you can just increase this to maybe like 35, and you can see it's moving it backwards. And if they are too far away from the car, you can also reduce this, right, to 30. And again, you could go here and you can change this into like cat mode run, for example, and you could have a slow in and a slow out. Okay, I'll leave it the way it is. Sorry, and I didn't want to do too much. Okay, so that's it for our emission and our location. Now we can start working on the amount. So this is nice to see that we have this working, but this is adding time dependence into our system. And this is the very last thing I want to do before the simulation itself. So we're going to leave that down there and let's keep working from here for now. So right now we only have one particle in each one of these locations. What I'd like to have is a bunch of particles being emitted, because these are just the impact points. Now we have to create the particles themselves. So the best thing to do is to create a copy to points, and we can copy a circle onto each one of them. Let's say it's going to be in the CX plane. There we go. And again, we need to add variation. So how do we add some variation onto this? Because right now all the impacts are the same size, right? Actually, I'll show you if we scatter some points. I'll turn off relax iterations. Okay, and let's turn this off and let's increase the density. They're all the same size, so that's not very interesting. So I'm going to create a point bob. Let's go in here and let's create a p-scale attribute. So we can create a random for every point number, and then we can have a ramp to control the distribution. So p-scale distribution, and then we can fit this into our minimum and maximum. So let's see, this will be our minimum size and this will be our max size. Okay, and now we can finally export this p-scale. There we go. Now we have some nice variation. Now I want to have a lot of small impacts and very few larger ones. Something like that. You can change this later on, but the rule of thumb is usually when you're doing something which is like, when you're distributing size, naturally the way it occurs is a lot of times you have a lot of smaller impacts. So you have smaller debris and then there's very few bigger debris, or in this case like big impacts. Again, it's just to add some variation. You can do it the opposite. The idea is just to have an exponential curve. So you can do this the other way around. And let's see, this is too big, right? If our bullet hits, this will be all the dirt that's going to be kicked up. So it's way too much. So let's see, this is going to be our smallest one. And this is going to be our biggest amount. And let's look at the actual sizes of the circle. So remember, this is a bullet. It's not going to be like a missile. So we don't have to go too overboard with the size of this. So I still think some of them are a bit too big for a regular bullet. So let's see, maybe something like that. And let's scatter points. And now obviously we need way more points. Okay, right now we have 3,000 points. Let's try to get it. Let's see, let's get it to something like 10,000. Maybe that's too much. We can go 25,000. Okay, that will work. So this isn't going to be the final amount. We'll probably end up using hundreds of thousands of points. But to test, it's very important that we keep our point count low so we can iterate fast. And then we can add variation in one more place, and that is we can add an attribute noise. So right now it's all looking like circles, so our source isn't looking very good. And let's see, let's fix this. There we go. So I'm going to add some noise to the position. Let's center the noise. We don't want any noise in the y-axis. In fact, we can just copy this, paste it, since we only want to deal with only two axes. And then the element size, that's our frequency. So let's see, we want it to be a lot finer. And then our roughness, we maybe want to add a bit more. See, I'm looking at these guys here. And then this broke up the size, I think, too much. So let's bring down the amplitude to maybe 0.1. All right, and now let's have a look at how this is looking from our camera view. So let's enable the points, hit play. Cool, I think that's working. So far we've covered our location, our amount, and our emission. Next, before we go into the simulation, in the next lesson, we're going to have a look at how to create a good velocity.